This is Dr. Fox. Thank you all for your continued support for CRPN and CRPN Central. For more information about our mission, please contact us today at info@crpaynet.com for details.
Welcome to the trial site. Please see the attached contract and budget. We'd prefer you sign as is, but if you have to make changes, please provide us with a dissertation for every reason and complete documentation.
Hello from Site 199. We are very excited to work with the sponsor and the CRO. Please accept our receipts here as proof that aligns our intent with your purpose. Please see a realistic budget and contract for such a complex trial.
Thanks for returning this so quickly. Your costs are much higher than any site we are working with. We'll escalate to the sponsor and get back to you.
Unreasonably high. We'll be patiently waiting to hear back from you after your careful review.
2 weeks later.
Do you have an update on the study contract and budget, as it has been 2 weeks?
Oh, it's sitting on my desk collecting dust. I'm still waiting on the sponsor to respond.
Well, this trial is a priority for us and our patients. We take effectiveness seriously with prompt implementation.
I'll follow up with the sponsor and let you know.
2 more weeks later.
Still no update on our study contract and budget?
I'll be out of the office for the next week. I'll return your email when I return.
2 more weeks later.
Hey, site, I just heard back from the sponsor. They approved your ridiculously high budget.
Excited to hear that you finally took into consideration our budget and contract. Unfortunately, we have decided to go with another client that was much more responsive. The goal is to accommodate our site as well as our patients. We humbly decline this trial offer at this time. Please keep us on your list for future trials that may align with our purpose and our goals.
Wow. Better tell the sponsor we lost another one. We may have to process a change order to get these sites onboarded. They are way too difficult to manage.
Negotiations, a taxing and contentious time in our industry that is pressured with impossible timelines, toxic interactions, and powerful struggles that leaves everyone, including our patients, losing. Clinical trials are extensive, complex, and challenging to predict collaborative costs between stakeholders. However, success is not impossible as long as we maintain our professional respect toward each other. Site administrators, I know the feeling, like everyone is waiting on you to do their jobs, and they tell you to hurry up, to just accept what is given to you, or, what's worse, to just sign without looking. Don't fall for it. Never negotiate desperately, ever. And know that you are far better rejecting the trial duds than being left with a mountain of debt and an underfunded responsibility. Sponsors and CROs, you are only one of many consumers seeking services at your community clinical research sites. Remember that it's competitive, it's low margin, and importantly, it's a business. Sites are here to help you to ensure that you succeed, but only with the adequate resources to do the job. Welcome to CRPN Central, the official podcast of the Clinical Research Payment Network. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Fox. CRPN Central discusses the real issues with our clinical research industry to explore and identify mutually beneficial solutions for all of our stakeholders. Clinical study negotiations are by far one of the largest, most contentious, and inefficient time sinks that our industry must endure for almost every trial we perform. We live in an age of efficiency and instant informational exchange. However, to date, we continue to process our contract negotiations in an archaic, delayed, and disastrous system. How can we develop a positive environment that promotes rapid and collaborative clinical trial startup times? Today, we will discuss clinical study negotiations at our clinical sites, defined as the dialogue between two or more parties to resolve points of difference and agree upon organizational service and subsequent compensation for those services. First, we will talk negotiations with an experienced and successful clinical site director. Then, we will explore the process with a professional with extensive experience at the CRO level. To maintain valid comparisons, both interviews will use the same questions, and my guests did not know the questions before the interviews. We will reconvene after the interviews to compare answers and perhaps identify potential practices that help to promote positive and collaborative experiences between our industry stakeholders. Our first guest is an experienced negotiator and site director in the industry. Alan Abraham is the Director of Clinical Trial Administration within the university systems and a Director of Clinical Research at Preferred Primary Care Physicians. Alan has extensive experience and strategies negotiating clinical trials for his sites and his physicians, and I'm so thankful he has taken the time to meet with us today. Please welcome with me Mr. Alan Abraham. Mr. Alan Abraham, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today.
Absolutely, glad to be here.
Would you be willing to introduce yourself to the audience?
Certainly, I am been in research since 2003, started as a research coordinator. Probably over the last 16 or 17 years have been involved in the administrative part of clinical trials. I'm the Director of Clinical Research for Preferred Primary Care Physicians, which is a group of 20 family practice and internal medicine sites throughout Western Pennsylvania. I also help out the University of Pittsburgh in their clinical trial administration department. So loves talking the business of clinical trials. It's definitely a tricky landscape, very complex way of we do things in the clinical trial business, and have certainly learned a lot over the last decade or so.
Today's topic is negotiations, specifically those points of time where we communicate our needs to sponsors and CROs. They communicate their expectations or willingness to provide resources to us. We both go back and forth and try to come to an understanding with each other so that we can progress research. Have you performed clinical trial negotiations in your career?
That is sort of my sweet spot. I just pulled up our clinical trial management system. One of our sites, we have 60 active trials, and I negotiated all those contracts. So I do negotiate the contracts and budgets, probably about 40 a year. So I have a whole sort of database of like who pays what and why and where. So I rely on that. And then a lot of it is just the art of negotiating, how you present things, how you justify things, really most importantly, how you communicate. If you're able to master that task, you can be very successful in this business.
And of all of those types of negotiations, is it all kinds of trials, or is there a certain sweet spot for you?
Because most of the sites are internal medicine or family practice, as you can imagine, you go to that position for basically anything. It could be related to vaccines, headaches, respiratory viruses, UTIs, many different diagnoses and trials in all those spaces. Anything that you would seem to go to your family physician for is pretty much what we have a trial in. In the university side, it's wildly different. There's a lot of traumatic injury, blood products, surgical interventions, those types of things, which are much different than the community family practice setting.
And every indication, especially the complexity of the trials, it makes the negotiating and the budgets and the planning so different in so many different ways. You start getting into a lot of the infusions or like oncology or even some of the customized medicines, the logistics around that, trying to predict those costs.
I've been exposed to many things, but oncology is the one thing I really don't negotiate. The one thing we do though in the business is if it is related to cardiology or neurology, we have other specialists that we work with. So we almost act as their CRO because they want to run the trial, but they have no resources to run the trial.
Today, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about negotiations. I've asked these questions to another individual before. When we're done, what we're going to do is we're going to compare what you say versus what the other individual says. And maybe we can try to find some form of an alignment so that we can identify the best practices for negotiations so that we can have good and positive experiences in clinical trials.
Okay, sounds good.
Can you walk me through the CTA negotiation process from start to finish?
You'll always get that email from the sponsor or the representative, and they'll give you a very basic template of costs. And I actually just pulled one today in preparation for this talk. This is a sponsor we always work with. We probably have over 50 trials, and I still get an initial email for a new trial with a baseline budget that we would never agree to, I always try to, within 48 hours, respond and come back with comments. I'll go through the entire every line item, and what happens is I probably have to add about 15 to 20 to 25 of our own line items. I have justifications for pretty much every single line item, so I'll put those in there immediately to save time. Say we need $15,000 for startup, but then not justify sort of why we need that. I'll put those all in there. I'll immediately send back something within 48 hours saying, here is what we need to run the trial. How complex is this? What are the labs involved? How much resources, data do we need? Sometimes I'll reach out to the coordinators. I'll get the full protocol. Sometimes I'll just look at the scheduled events if I'm familiar with the sponsor and sort of the IP that we're using, and then send it back and say, here's sort of what we need. In many cases, I try to build a relationship with that person up front and then leave it in their court and go from there. Because everything's like, we need to have this done really quick. I'll get it back to someone in 48 hours and you don't hear back for a week or so. And so you sort of have to ping them. It's much easier if it's a sponsor I've worked with previously. Occasionally then we'll get some random CRO or sponsor that sometimes that takes more time just to sort of get the baseline agreement of what these fees are that they'll pay for. Every single time I will hear from a sponsor or CRO, we don't pay for that. This is the only amount we can give you. You have to be in a spot as a site in which you're able to walk away from something if you feel that it's just not going to be worth your while. It's no different than any trade for service agreement related to anything. And so that's how the initial interaction goes. We'll receive that. I'll send off the initial email with my sort of comments and fees and then wait for the response.
Wow, you can turn that around in 48 hours, which is completely impressive.
I don't want to be the person that they're waiting for. I want to make sure that if you're giving us this trial and you want this information, I'm going to give it back to you. That is something I'll drop everything else and get this out ASAP.
And I've always found a 3-to-1 ratio when it comes to return. So for every day that contract is on my desk, it takes me 3 days to get it back.
That's also been my experience. These companies are large. They have so many people working in tandem on multiple agreements, and many times things get lost in the shuffle. My goal is to make things happen quickly. You know, in research, there's so many regulations and things we need to do. At the end of the day, we need to get these trials out to patients. As I'm negotiating the numbers through all these things, there are really patients waiting to be able to come to our site to at least have the opportunity to participate. So I always remember that as I'm doing any work related to these trials.
You had mentioned that if it's a relationship that you have or a sponsor you've worked with before, it tends to work better. I share that sentiment, and oftentimes it's because you know who to talk to.
Everything is about relationships. The thing that helps me the most, I don't take anything personal. This is strictly business. So whether they're lying, whether they don't know, I don't really care. The bottom line is I just want to make sure that our sites are protected and we get a fair amount for what we're doing. If they say they can't do that, I'm like, oh, no, you can. Here's what we're going to do. This is what we need to conduct the trial. So if you can do that, fabulous. If you can't, no worries. I understand. We're just going to have to pass. I don't use that phrase, we're going to have to pass, much, but occasionally I do. And next thing you know, believe it or not, they're like, oh, you know what? We talked to the sponsor and they said they can agree to this. Whereas for a month, they've been saying they couldn't do this. Generally, a lot of these people that are negotiating these contracts are, in many cases, lower level employees. They're following orders. Here's the template. You send this out. You can only agree to this amount. If you can do that, great. Otherwise, they have to punt it to their supervisor or to the sponsor. I don't want to make that be much more of a delay. So I try to get back to people within 48 hours and supply them all the justifications up front so they don't keep coming back and forth with, why do you need this sort of questions.
What do you think makes a good negotiation?
Again, the relationship that you have with that person, even if you barely know them, you're just chit-chatting through email, the expectation. If you set expectations that you're absolutely not going to get everything you want, that doesn't work in real life. It definitely doesn't work in a clinical trial negotiation. You have to be somewhat flexible. You have to be able to stand your ground. You can ask for anything as long as you do it respectfully. You could disagree, that's fine. But I think really the relationship with that person really is your best tool to making things go much more smoothly.
I kind of went that direction too. It was a relationship. It kind of got to where it was the third pushback and they were still holding firm on what I knew was wrong. And I knew that it is going to cost the site if we accepted this. And I told them, look, let's come to an understanding here. I have to be responsible for this trial to perform it. You're going to be done with this after you ship it off. You don't have skin in the game to get this completed appropriately. I do. So please trust me when I say what you are offering me will not pay the bills.
One of the benefits I have in negotiating is many people who negotiate these contracts have never, ever treated a patient, been in a room with a patient. Most of my career, I was involved in cardiovascular surgery, working with modified heart-lung machines and working in intensive care units, working with families and patients all the time. Nothing is ever as simple as it seems.
They'll pay you for the visit. The visit took 3 hours to perform, but they don't see the time before to schedule the visit, to work with the doctor, and they don't see the time after, the hours that were spent filling out source and completing it. Monitoring visits. Let's talk about monitoring visits.
Yes, let's talk about monitoring visits.
Same thing. We will pay you for the time that it takes for you to babysit our CRA. We're not going to pay you for the hours that it took you to prep for that. We're not going to pay you for the QA ahead of that. And we're not going to pay you for the queries performed after.
The follow-up is as much as work as the days that they're on site. So that all needs to be captured. And I say that, it's like, well, we need to capture this somewhere. Perfect little trick that a lot of sponsors use is they'll say, we'll pay you $500 per monitor visit. Well, per visit, they could be there 2 or 3 days. So you're still just getting that $500. And then that covers what you need to respond to once they send you the report back. An easy method is to say, well, we'll take $250 a day, $300 a day, $500 a day. Per day is how you want to negotiate that, not per monitor visit report. And there's all these sort of subtle things across multiple line items. In a year's time on one trial, you could lose, say, $10,000. So we have 60 trials. Imagine if we're bleeding money a little bit here or there. So it's my job to protect the sites, to make sure that they are sustainable and that they can still see patients. And a lot of it boils down to money. You need money for everything. I sort of am entrusted with making sure that we can provide this to patients, but we also need to make sure we can pay all of the bills. Sometimes I feel like I have to literally go step by step with some of these justifications. You have to sort of have a structure in place where you could ask for these fees, and then it's negotiation. A lot of it is the starting point, the relationship, and you have to know your value. The bottom line is cut through it all and say, here's why we need this. If you need any further explanation, please call me. I always offer a call. Rarely do people ever want to call or video chat.
I found that too. It almost feels like they don't want to get connected to you.
Yeah.
I really wonder if they try to prevent relationships to save money. I know it sounds odd, but it really does feel like their phone call is like their emergency red button. They will not talk to you.
And I offer that all the time, especially if there's some issue with payments. I'm sending you what you asked me. There's still some issue. Can we just talk for like 5 minutes and resolve this? And then it always ends up being like, they'll get back to you and say, oh, no, how about this? It's any option other than like a phone or video chat.
Yeah, other than actually getting it fixed.
Correct.
What makes a nightmare negotiation?
I've been doing this 15 years. I've refused 2 trials. So it was a new sponsor, and the person on the other end was not flexible with anything. No matter what I said, no matter what justification, except all the other sites are accepting this amount instead of that amount, but it would happen for every single line item. So I got to the point where I was like, well, we're not going to be able to do this. If there's no connection at all with anyone, that makes the worse. You're looking at 50 line items. You have to be able to say, oh yeah, I agree to this or I agree to that. But in this case, this person just either was not really good at communicating. We had 0 relationship. It was a new sponsor. Nothing that I had sent their way was agreeable. They delayed getting back to me. And at some point, if 2 people come into your office and one who's very timely, very professional, and you like, and another person comes in and they're the opposite of that, and you can only give one thing, you're going to give it to the person you have a relationship with. And so it was a point where I was like, this is back and forth. This is a waste of my time, no matter what I tried. And I really think it was just based on relationships, because at the end, when I said, well, we're just going to pass on it, they were offended. They couldn't believe that we passed on it. They felt like we should have just taken what they offered.
I've had negative negotiation experiences. It's often because I've tried to do all of the right things. I wrote pages, novels of justification, and it just fell on blind eyes. It was literally just a robotic, no, you will do this, No,
Correct.
this is maximum. That is it. Compliance. That's about as far as it went.
Right.
Finally, I thought, I'm not even talking to a human being here. I'm just talking to someone who really doesn't care.
Exactly. And then, you're going to run into those types of people. Not everybody's amazing at what they do. It's certainly not everybody's personable. They do not have that sort of interpersonal communication skills. And so those are the people that can be less effective. That person I was dealing with, maybe they were really, really smart, but they didn't know how to deal with people. That'll cripple you every single time.
Or bullies.
Correct.
Or sponsors who think that they're more important than sites or that sites are disposable. Any kind of an inequality, I feel, in a negotiation pathway is set for failure.
It's always historically the sponsors and CROs, they have the money. And so they try to leverage, well, we're going to award you this trial, but you can accept only this amount of money. Well, you have to position yourself in a site to be successful enough that you can just say, no, thanks.
Never negotiate desperately, ever.
Right.
It always leads to failure for everyone.
There's one larger sponsor that we have had some trials with, and they historically pay really lower fees compared to everybody else. And so I refused a certain trial with them, and they couldn't believe it because we had been running their trials. And they, of course, were like, oh, we'll bring this up to our directors. We know we have heard this complaint before. Okay, well, if this is a common thing, then it probably is a problem. A year later, they definitely did increase some of their fees. If I would have continued to accept those low fees, that would cripple every other site as well. Every site's going to be doing basically free work. And so if all sites were equipped with the knowledge to know that you can negotiate higher, you have to know your value. Here's sort of what you should be expecting to get for this line item. That's helpful to every site, not just my site. I don't want to be the most expensive house on the street. I want everyone's value to increase.
Every time you push back on an underfunded budget, you just help sites across the industry to be more successful.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
If what you do is done by multiple sites, it's the sites who will be the ones to be controlling fair market value, not a subscription contract graveyard.
I totally agree. On some level, sites are competing for trials, but on another level, we're really all in this together. Anything you agree to can be used against you or be used against your fellow site. And a lot of times at the sites, the people negotiating the contracts are very inexperienced. They really don't know. And so they're taken advantage of.
What are your top 5 negotiated invoiceable items?
Definitely archiving fees, just because I know that that's something that could bite you down the road for years to come. Even today, there's sponsors here that say we don't pay for monitoring. They'll say it's part of the job. And I will say, yeah, it is part of the job, and we need to be paid for part of the job. Something new that we've been including is diversity initiatives. It's separate from advertising or recruitment costs or screening fees. We have been presenting to some sponsors. We have sort of a playbook on diversity where we can go into certain communities, provide our doctors to give educational talks, to educate them better, to allow them to know that this is an opportunity. And then, really a lot of the similar type of recruitment initiatives, protocol amendments that hopefully they don't happen that much. SIV a lot of times takes a lot of time. Obviously startup. If you just focus on startup, there's so many other sort of line item fees that you're not capturing.
Startup is the most scrutinized fee.
It's the most scrutinized fee. So what I try to do is fractionate that out into everything else.
You're better off having a lower startup and itemization
you are.
than to have a big lump sum, because they will scrutinize that. They'll say, tell us where all of this is going, and then you have to have it all itemized anyway. You may as well make it multiple fees.
Annual fees is really an important one as well. Annual lab fees, annual pharmacy fees, annual regulatory fees. And I will always get, well, what do you mean by an annual regulatory fee? And then I'll literally send them a list of 40 things involved in regulatory related to everything we need to do. A new employee comes. It's not just submitting an annual report to the IRB. Those annual fees add up. Those are some of the big ones that could certainly make or break sites if you're not getting fees for those types of things.
There's many. One of the big things CROs come back and say is they say, oh, this is the cost of doing business.
They do.
And I look at them and I say, well, for one, the cost of doing business is not an unfunded mandate.
Right.
And two, I'm from Missouri. So I'm from what we call the show me state. Show me in the budget where this is getting paid. And if you can find it, no problem. I'll let it go.
Right.
If you can't find it, and we both agree that this is a cost, it has to be somewhere in the budget.
You got to put it somewhere.
But Not having it is unacceptable.
The overhead costs, you can put 25%, you can put 40%. It's a wild west. There's some room there. Larger health systems obviously charge 50, 65%. They always come back initially, it's maybe 20%. The cost of overhead over the last 5 years
it's skyrocketed. Most of the sites I work with won't settle at an overhead lower than 35%. And depending on the indication and the institution, most overhead is in the mid 40s now.
Yep, that makes sense. That's about what I'm seeing when I'm doing it as well. You have to look at the whole picture. It's all a bunch of back and forth related to the business, new business, all the line items in the contracts, the overhead.
How may we create a better negotiation environment in clinical research?
You definitely have to use some data. A lot of the data that sponsors or CROs use is outdated. And they've told me, they've pulled up information about us. I'm like, that's wildly inaccurate. You have to sort of know what you've previously accepted. That could work against you though too, because if you've accepted low values previously, they'll point immediately to that and say, well, you accepted this a year ago.
What's funny is if you point to the high values that they've accepted, they refute it and say, well, we don't follow that anymore.
Right. But a low value, they'll haunt you with that. 5 years ago, you could have accepted something and they'll say, yeah, well, you accepted in this contract. And you look at the date and you're like, well, yeah, a lot has happened in 5 years. Certainly, interpersonal communication skills is going to be your most effective tool to get what you want. Life lesson 101. The person that is able to present things in a clear and concise manner related to justifications and need is always going to be much more successful in the negotiation process. And third is you really need to be organized to know what exactly you have previously accepted, what the sponsors can pay historically, and certainly the science of the trials is helpful to know certain things that occur and how long it's going to take you.
And sometimes common sense, somehow it's lost.
I'm a very common sense person. We're going to go from point A to point B. We can meet about things, plan things, add extra steps, or we could just have a reasonable conversation and then roll it out. If we roll it out and it's not working, okay, then we know it's not working and we adjust.
If I were to hand you the microphone right now and I was going to say, what would you like to tell the entire industry about clinical research negotiations and how we can make them better, what would you say?
I would say the number one thing to always remember as we're going through this process is that there are patients who are really, really suffering with different diseases, and that they really are relying on opportunities for new drugs or therapies. No matter what the dollars and the cents and people's egos, the end line for all this is to get these trials open to enrollment really, really quickly for the patients. I know that's not always possible. There are many regulatory and financial hoops to jump through. Always remember at the end of the day, the most important thing is there are patients really suffering every day related to many different afflictions. Never get frustrated. It's an art. There is no protocol. So once you sort of realize that, you give your best effort, you show your justifications, and know your value. Don't take anything personally. It's not worth it.
Have common sense. Don't take it personally. Be human. Talk to everyone. And importantly, realize that budget negotiations are literally just a means to an end. And hopefully that end is patient care, hope for our patients. It is literally all about the patients, not only the ones that are going to be in the trials, but the ones that we could be saving for decades to come. And the longer we take to negotiate, the longer it's going to take to save those lives.
Yeah, it really does. It is just a major delay to really affording people treatment options that they wouldn't normally have.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central. This was a perfect conversation, and I look forward to sharing this with the audience.
Glad to be here, Daniel, and we will talk again.
All right. Thank you, sir. I'll talk to you later.
All righty. Have a good day.
Bye. Our next guest has worked in CRO contract management for over 14 years. Viljena Trask is an experienced CRO veteran who has spent over a decade working as a contract manager and site relationship lead in a global CRO setting. She is also one of the key panelists who will be discussing negotiations at the first annual Save Our Sites conference this February 2nd in Tucson, Arizona. Viljena has extensive negotiating experience from a CRO's perspective, and I'm so thankful she has taken the time to speak with us today. Please welcome with me Miss Viljena Trask. Viljena Trask, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Good to be here.
Viljena, would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, my name is Viljena Trask. I am based in Research Triangle Park. I have been in the CRO pharma industry in clinical development for 14 years now. I slipped into it through finance, accounts payable, and I immediately jumped into site payments. That was my day-to-day for year and a half. Sites sending us paper invoices, scanning, getting approvals, and so on, keying them in the system and making sure that sites are getting paid within the 30-day payment terms. Sites calling me, calling the sites. And then I decided that I wanted to do something different. I went into site contracts and budget negotiations. I learned how to negotiate for a living. I've been doing that for about 10 years now. I've negotiated on hundreds of trials with thousands of sites over the course of my career. It's been a fun journey.
Today's discussion is our favorite topic ever, the negotiation process. Specifically, that process that we all love to do, where we all go back and forth, we negotiate, we talk about a trial, we figure out what we need and what we're willing to accept for that trial, and then we execute a contract.
Yes.
You've literally done negotiations for a living. How many site-facing negotiations do you think you have performed?
Literally hundreds. I tried to run metrics at some point a couple of years ago, and it's kind of hard. Even though I stayed with the same organization for the entire time, the systems change, new vendors come in, there's switchovers, you go from Excel trackers to more sophisticated systems like Viva and Activate and so on. It might be over 1,000 sites that I definitely have negotiated, executed contracts, and it's a lot.
And I would imagine sites of all different kinds.
Yes, not only, United States and Canada. My very first negotiation actually was with a site in Latvia.
Wow.
My boss back in the day, who taught me everything I know, was like, hey, we have the site in Latvia. We're having difficulties with the attorney. The CRA on the ground was not able to move the contract forward. So he's like, hey, can you call them? I'm like, okay, never negotiated before. So I call him. We go through the contract in Latvian, which is my first language, and I listen to him. And all it takes is to listen.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that you need? And I will figure out a way to make it happen. And please explain why you need it. We wrapped it up with a pretty bow. The contract was executed the same week and it was done.
Wow.
Very quickly. And that sort of has been my approach from thereafter. Send it to them, see what they need, ask them why they need it, understand why they need it, be reasonable about why you need it, and you can make things happen. And then, having a lot of connections that help you understand how to move things forward within the organization that you're in helps tremendously as well.
If it was only that simple, it seems like an equation. I'm going to ask you a series of questions today, and I'm going to ask those questions to another individual.
Okay.
And what we're going to do is we're going to compare how you answer the questions to that other individual. And maybe we can identify certain similarities between the answers so that we can understand maybe that secret sauce to constantly scale good and successful negotiations in the clinical research process.
Let's do it.
Can you walk me through just your understanding of the CTA negotiation process from start to finish?
The clock starts when the templates go out to sites, and you have to have the contract, you have to have the budget, and in your back pocket, depending on the contracting structure, you have to have your either letter of authority or letter of indemnification. You send it to site and you wait for site to respond to you. If they don't, you follow up. If they still don't respond to you, you have to make sure that you have the right person you're talking to. I would always pick up the phone and like, hey, did you get my email? Because everybody is exchanging documents through email. Once they respond, you try to find out, hey, this is our goal. This is when we want to get your site activated. How long is it going to take you to get this done? And that's where you find the first discrepancy. What sites state on their feasibility questionnaire is very different
versus what can actually happen.
The intent is there, but what ultimately happens when everybody's not on the same page about how quickly we need to turn around things, that's when those timelines get extended.
So I have to ask, was it common for sites not to respond to you about a trial?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It happens a lot.
Every site that I talk, they're looking at their email like a hawk and responding right away. Is there a certain site demographic that takes a while to respond?
In the end, it definitely is the type of sites. So you have your central RB sites and then you have your local RB sites is how we categorize them. Central RB sites are usually, quick to turn around, but it depends. Some might be quicker because they have dedicated resources to turn around those things. Some might be slower because, somebody's out of the office, there's holidays, or maybe it's the one study coordinator who does everything.
And they just so happen to be gone.
Yeah, or they just have so much on their plate they can't look at your contract or budget. Then you have your academic sites with the red tape. They have their processes. They have their pre-award feasibilities where they are not going to look at your contract for months and months until they have their their internal approvals that they have the resourcing to run the trial at the site. The whole spectrum. I mean, we could wait for 6 months for a site to provide their initial budget revisions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's say you send out an award and you wait, or you don't wait, but you get a response back from the site. Thanks, it's received. We'll take a look at it. And then they'll take a look at it. They'll send you back a first counter.
Right.
What do you do?
The first thing I do, if it's a contract or a budget, I always make sure that they haven't tampered with the template. That's very important because we want to make sure that we see all the changes. And sometimes changes get in there that we were not made aware of. Then you just start reviewing from top to bottom. The one thing that is super, super helpful for me to quickly turn it around as a negotiator is if you have provided documentation for the budget requests that were not initially offered by the sponsor or the CRO. If you change your overhead, I want to see overhead policy. If you have your startup fees, pharmacy lab, archiving, your EDC, just tons of things. If there is something that is not included, or, let's say you want a $20,000 open the door fee, I want to see what's included in it. Don't just state, oh, our startup fee policy is that it's $5,000 and that's it. Well, what's covered by it?
So transparency.
Transparency, documentation. I want you to provide reasoning and rationale. Why do you need these items in the budget?
I have a question, and I've always wondered about this because we get that a lot. You have to write a dissertation for everything that you want to justify. And even when you write a dissertation, you have like a very small percentage chance that it gets approved. Do you ever have sites push back and say, show me yours, I'll show you mine? Where's your justification for the ridiculously low amounts that you're giving me? How do you ask a site for so much justification without giving them justification for your decision?
I have not ever received an answer like that or a request, but I want to see justification for things that are outside of my parameters. Pharma, they'll have pre-established parameters. It's going to be a list of items and ranges, which is what is considered fair market value for those type of activities. I want to give you the money, but I can't.
You have to check a box as a negotiator.
Yeah, I want to give it to you. If it's reasonable, I want to give it to you.
The response that I've been giving that has worked a lot because it only makes sense. I fully respect that you need this information. Please understand the CRO information is proprietary and confidential, and you're not allowed to share it with me. I'm not allowed to share my site information with you. It's against our protocols. So I can tell you this, and that's fine, but we have to go on a level of trust here. I'm not allowed to show you information. You're not allowed to show me information. So we both have to figure out a way to get through this together. And it works because the CRO representative knows, okay, they get it. They understand that I'm not allowed to share, and now I have to understand they aren't allowed to share either.
That's a very interesting situation. I have not experienced that before. My assumption is that that's covered by the CDA.
Generally, what it'll turn into is, I'm sorry, our protocol, our SOPs don't allow us to share that proprietary information with you. And then someone said that, oh, well, we're covered by CDA. And I said, okay, well, then you can show me yours, right? No, that's against our policies. Okay, there you go. So we are both at a point where we're negotiating, and I get it. You're negotiating blind, but I am too. So we have to come at good faith to negotiate together. What do you think makes a good negotiation?
I'm going to go back to transparency and documents that are easy to work with. If a document is easy to work with, whether it's a Word document or Excel document, you're marking up your documents so you can communicate to the other person clearly what is it you want and why you want it. That's when it's easy. When people are on the same page, they understand how the process works. When you are easy to work with as a person, because a lot of times I would just pick up the phone and ask the site like, hey, I don't quite understand this request. Can you walk me through it? Instead of sending an email. I'll send an email afterwards like, hey, we talked about this and yes, I will approve it and so on. We're all people. Let's work on this together. We both have deadlines and expectations from, our superiors and so on, where we want to wrap this up, and just being human. It's so easy to wrap up these negotiations when the homework has been done by the people who set up the contract templates, the people who set up the budget templates. The negotiation parameters for the CRO or pharma negotiator are robust. That was one of the things that I would always fight for when I would build budgets through grant plan or grant manager. Like, no, we need this because sites will request it. You sort of preface it with, hey, it's going to be less escalations to you, sponsor. It's going to free up your time. Give us a bigger bucket because because historically, this is what these specific sites have been asking for. And having worked with hundreds of sites, you know what they're going to ask for and you can convey that message. So, yeah, being a knowledgeable negotiator, you have to know your trade well, you have to know your stakeholders well. I'm very thankful for the opportunity that I've had so many experiences where I've learned that, how to work with sites. What is it that sites want and why do they need it?
Well, having a sense of understanding, yeah, being able to justify it. I also noticed you said that one of the first things you do is you check for undisclosed changes in a template. That might be a level of trust that gets built between the negotiators. A prime example, this just happened. We received an award letter from a CRO. The award letter started out with the phrase, "We would prefer you accept this budget without change."
Oh, that's standard language.
From a site's perspective, we're on a negotiating path here. And we know the game. We're supposed to negotiate. When that email goes out, there's an immediate break of trust. And so you start off on a really, really bad foot.
The person who drafted it probably has never attempted to learn what it is like to be a site.
Yeah, not the greatest. Can you tell me an example of your nightmare negotiation?
I'm a very positive person. I don't know what would you consider the worst. I mean, there's a very big spectrum of the different types and things that can happen or don't happen. In the end, is the site worth the money to the sponsor? I considered a very excessive, like we're talking tens of thousands of dollars startup fee. That was like, why are we paying the site so much? And the site has a master rate card. 1 week we were fully executed. I did not have to negotiate anything, but the site got so much money. And to me, ethically, it was like, are we really paying that much money to a site to get them up and running?
That happens a lot with key opinion leaders in like academia and things like that.
Yeah, and I don't think they even were a key opinion leader, but I was just like raising eyebrows.
I ran into a situation where we received a first offer from a sponsor that was quadrupled what I have ever received or seen in a contract before. In that situation, turns out the PI was on the board of the company and did not fill it out in the FDF.
Ooh.
There's a lot of stuff going on. And sometimes as administrators or even as CROs, you have to look at that and think to yourself, ooh. I've been in yelling matches with sponsors and CROs. I have been punished for speaking up through timelines and negotiations. And there's a lot of activity that's performed between sponsor site and CRO that is not necessarily being that positive aspect.
Yeah.
There's a lot of contention. As far as nightmare goes, every time I've had a negative experience in negotiations, it has to do with someone trying to be a bully. And someone not necessarily considering the other as an equal, or at least as an equal professional, someone who's in here to accomplish clinical research rather than throw a title around, throw a salary around.
I consider myself lucky because I really cannot think of a single negotiation that was a nightmare. In a negotiator position at a CRO or pharma, you're like, okay, we're just going to walk away. There have been like situations where it gets very tedious and it's like, is it worth our time? In the end, it's first to market, and is this site really worth the money? And having to go to pharma compliance and trying to justify all the fees and making sure there's all this scrutiny against fair market value and benchmarking and stuff like that, it just gets unnecessarily prolonged when it shouldn't be.
The big thing right now that's happening is sponsors are saying, well, we'd prefer to get away from invoiceables. So they're giving sites budgets with 2 invoiceables, startup and closeout. We come back and we say, hold on a minute here. There's a lot of stuff that the schedule of assessments is not paying for.
Exactly.
Well, we'd prefer to get away from invoiceables. Okay, so if you want to do that, we'll just inflate the overhead rate to pay for everything. Well, no, we have an overhead rate cap. You have to pick something. You can't get something for nothing. We need to be paid for this.
Yes. Dry ice. We don't know when you're going to ship it. I don't know how many pregnancy tests you're going to do. You have men, women, whatever. It is more expensive on the CRO pharma side and then site side to administratively process an invoice than the procedure is worth. And that was one of the things that I was dealing last year as well. Sites would come like, hey, in lieu of this, we will increase the overhead, but we will just absorb whatever cost of these invoiceables. If somebody has to reconsent, we'll just increase it by a few percentage points. And I talked through it with the study manager that I was supporting. And we're like, hey, if I don't have to see another invoice come through, it's one less thing for me to worry about. Let's do it. Yes. I'm like, yeah, here's your justification for an increased overhead. Problem solved. And it's been documented. Site has provided the documentation and that's it. We're covered. If something happens down the line, oh, well, this particular procedure that's conditional is not included in the budget. No, it is. So much less headache for everybody.
Tell me your 5 favorite negotiated invoiceable line items.
So usually sites or the budgets start with, your startup costs, archiving costs, and that's it. The hot topic item for last year that we all were scratching our heads was monitoring.
Really?
You know how back in the day, monitoring was a staff effort. We are required to monitor sites. It's a regulatory requirement. A lot of sites are charging for on-site and or remote monitoring these days.
We've always done that.
A lot of sites don't know that they can, but if you have a dedicated monitoring room, let's say with 5-10 separate cubicles, rooms, whatever, everything's set up, you have a printer, you have a dedicated monitoring coordinator and everything, monitoring fees for every visit. Then the other fee is pharmacy startup, maintenance, closeout, which you have to know. And during the early startup, you don't have the pharmacy manual, you don't have the lab manual yet. We just wanted to negotiate, but a lot of times we don't know who's going to pick up the drug at the end of the study. Is site responsible for destructing it? Is the CRA going to come by and do the accountability? I&D safety reports. A lot of sites are charging for like the e-regulatory systems.
That's starting, and some CROs are pushing back and some are starting to get that in their system.
Recruiting advertising.
Yes.
When site is requesting a recruiting advertising fee, especially for an indication where it doesn't make sense, I want to hear from them, what is your recruitment plan for this indication? I have had situations where like, this is not applicable at all. We are waiting for that patient to walk into your practice. An indication like HIV, somebody who's newly diagnosed walks into your clinic. We can't exactly advertise it. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. For advertising, the way I was trained, the way I negotiated throughout the years, the requirement was we want to know what your advertising plan is, how you're going to spend the money, and what do you expect the return is going to be from that.
Those are 5 really hot topics. We don't even talk about CRA changes.
Oh, that's so unpredictable. Like the CRA changes, translations. I like that for the translations, for example, if you're using Advera, they'll translate the ICF. That's kind of nice. That site does not have to worry about it. And a lot of times they'll have like the Spanish translation.
Well, IBC committees. Don't forget IBC committees. That's a big one now.
Yes. All those little committee fees and so on. Definitely. Protocol amendment and annual review, the admin fee. You are going to be doing work to get your site to run this trial, either under new amendment, there's work involved, or to renew for another year. Yes. Don't forget to capture that effort.
And don't forget to separate protocol amendment by regulatory and legal and make them 2 separate line items.
Yes.
How may we create a better negotiation environment in clinical research?
I think the first thing, education. A lot of times, negotiators who start out, I wish they would get the training that I did back in the day, where somebody actually sits down with you, walks you through the contract. Somebody sits down with you and explains to you how the budget works, that the budget is a reflection of not only the schedule of events in the protocol, but also all that's required to walk the patient through your pre-screening to end of trial. And a lot of negotiators who start in the industry, they don't quite understand how it works. I love that the posts on LinkedIn and so on, where some of our colleagues, they become clinical trial participants. They learn the site perspective, the patient and caregiver burden. Once you experience it, you understand what it takes for a site to run a clinical trial. And when you have that empathy, that's when the gears in your brain start moving. How can we make this better? And also have that connection with, why do we do this? Yes, everybody does it for a paycheck, but nothing has ever motivated me more to get a contract and budget negotiated, done, fully executed and everything, when I knew there was a patient waiting for the trial to open at that specific site and they have a life-changing treatment ready for them. That is something that 5:30 p.m. on a Friday, when you have a full house and you don't know if you're going to get that final signature from an academic site, whoever the sponsor or CRO signature is, you just stay on until you get that contract executed, because the amount of passion that a lot of people have in this industry just overshadows any petty side contracting issues. That's why I come from positivity and how can we make this better.
I have witnessed it. I know people have reported it. We have seen patients die because a contract was not negotiated. If any negotiator out there is listening to this right now, this is far more than some kind of a fight with a site. There are patient lives on hand, and it's very important to take this with the respect that it deserves. If I were to hand you the microphone right now and I said, what would you like to tell the entire industry about negotiations in our industry and how we can make them better? What would you tell them?
There are just so many moving parts, and it's impossible to learn all the moving parts of the process as a negotiator. As a site, be ready, be on board, be responsive. Tell us what your process is, what's your internal process, how long it's going to take you. Have the documentation, whichever documentation you're able to provide on your letterhead, ready for sites who just blindly sign as soon as they receive the contract. Please read it. Every CRO has a different contract template. It may not be the same that it was last time you signed. Please take a look at it. Please make sure that you go through it with a fine-tooth comb and just double check all the terms to make sure that that is what your business requires.
When we all put our heads together and focus on a problem, it can get fixed, and we have seen it. It's just a matter of working together and having an understanding for our industry collaborators, and we have to want each other to succeed.
Exactly.
Viljena, thank you so much for coming on to CRP and Central. I had an excellent conversation, and I look forward to sharing this with the audience.
I'm looking forward to listening to this.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Alan has served as a site administrator and negotiator for over 17 years. A good negotiator creates relationships, is flexible, understands each stakeholder's needs, will return requests within 48 hours, and is not afraid to walk away if a trial's resources aren't necessarily a good fit for the site. Negotiations require a fine balance of developing connecting professional relationships and not taking decisions personally. No work performed is as simple as it seems. However, you can ask for anything in a negotiation if you do it respectfully with the appropriate justification, documentation, and itemization of the services provided. The worst negotiation experiences happen when there is no connection. Never negotiate desperately, and know that when you agree to underfunded trials, you hurt not only your ability to perform responsible research, but also the abilities of every site in the industry. Stay organized, use common sense, and build a professional relationship with a mutual understanding that everything negotiated isn't as much for the dollars and the cents, but rather for the patients who are suffering and waiting for you to finish this negotiation. Viljena has negotiated with clinical research sites in the US, Canada, Latvia, and worldwide for over 14 years. Negotiations don't have to be difficult, and in fact, they are processed rapidly as long as we understand each other, be reasonable, justify our requests, do our homework, listen to each other, and explain our stories with our negotiating counterparts. She often must wait for days, weeks, or even months after following up for sites to respond to her awards. And although feasibility is generally not representative of actual outcomes and benchmarking data tends to be inaccurate and outdated, we can overcome our differing opinions if we document transparently, treat each other with compassion and professional equality, and provide reason and rationale for the resources that we need. Be ready. Have patience with the many moving parts. Read your contracts thoroughly and understand that while we continue to argue over these budgets, patients continue to suffer, sometimes even die, with every day that we delay finalizing our contracts. Both of today's guests agree that successful negotiations utilize detailed justifications and established relationships. Both guests also agree that currently used benchmarking data is severely outdated and that, importantly, everything we do is always and will always be for our patients. And while Alan's site dedicates a response to his collaborators within 48 hours, Viljena experiences the opposite, with sites who require extensive response times and follow-ups. So, how can we develop a positive environment that promotes rapid and collaborative clinical trial startup times? Although they work on two different sides of the industry, our guests had remarkably similar answers. To foster positive negotiation environments, we must focus closely on justification, understanding, and relationships. Help each other to complete your responsibilities with well-explained rationale for your requests. Communicate regularly and set professional expectations between each other. And although many times your negotiating counterpart may be considered an opponent, focus on a mutual passion not to earn the highest dollar or agree to the lowest cost, but to bring clinical trials to the patients who are suffering with every day that we wait to finish these contracts. Thank you for listening to today's special negotiations podcast. Negotiations are a critical part of business no matter what industry we are in. And instead of fostering contention among sites and CROs, please remember there is a mutual reason we are doing business together in the first place. Thank you to Alan and Viljena for taking the time to speak with me today. Thank you to Nicole Palmer and Erica Harris for volunteering in today's CRPN Short. Finally, thank you to my CRPN sponsors for helping to make this podcast possible. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time on CRPN Central.